Hello, Night Seekers, and welcome to Lacuna Noir. This is where forgotten stories and gentle voices meet, carrying you softly into peaceful sleep, wrapped in mystery. Before tonight's tale begins, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if you're drawn to these quiet, shadowed nights, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss a story when darkness calls. Now, close your eyes, get comfortable, and let's drift into the unknown together. That New Year's Eve is one my family still talks about, in a low voice, even now. Not because of the party or the fireworks or anything celebratory, but because of what was happening just a few houses away while everyone else was counting down to midnight. At the time, my parents were going through a divorce, so things were already fractured. I wasn't there that night. My mom and my brother were at a family New Year's party without me, trying to keep things normal, trying to keep some sense of tradition alive despite everything else falling apart. It was supposed to be loud, crowded, and distracting. The kind of night where you lose track of time and let the noise drown out your thoughts. The television was on, fireworks lighting up the screen. People were laughing, talking over each other, glasses clinking. Midnight came and went. Another year started just like that. No one had any idea that at almost the exact same time, something unimaginably violent was unfolding right next door to our home. We didn't find out right away. There were no screams carried across the street, no obvious signs that something was wrong, nothing that would have cut through the noise of a New Year's celebration. The house next door looked the same as it always had. Lights on, quiet from the outside, normal. It wasn't until later that the truth surfaced, and it surfaced in the most horrifying way possible. Someone found the neighbor's grandmother hiding in our bushes. She was terrified, shaking, disoriented. She wasn't supposed to be outside, let alone crouched in shrubbery in the middle of the night. She had escaped the house barefoot, desperate to get away. Hiding wherever she could because she didn't know what else to do or where else to go, she was found clinging to the bushes like they were the only thing keeping her alive. That's when the police were called. That's when everything changed. Only afterward did the story come together. The kid from the neighboring house had killed his entire family. While people were watching fireworks on TV and hugging each other and saying Happy New Year, he was moving through his own home and ending lives. There was no warning anyone recognized at the time. No build-up that neighbors noticed. Just violence, sudden and absolute. It didn't make sense then, and it still doesn't now. When police started investigating, more details came out, each one unsettling in its own way. The kid had mental health issues, serious ones. It wasn't something subtle or newly developed. It was known. His mother had even checked him out for New Year's, either from a facility or from some form of care, wanting him home for the holiday, wanting her family together to start the year. That decision ended everything. Trying to imagine that moment from her perspective is unbearable. A mother believing she's doing the right thing, believing love and familiarity might help, believing one night together couldn't hurt. And then the unthinkable happens, and the person she was trying to protect becomes the one everyone needs protection from. For my family, the realization came with a sickening sense of proximity. This didn't happen across town. It didn't happen in a place we didn't know. It happened next door, in a house we passed every day, a family we recognized. A kid who lived close enough that our lives overlapped in small, unremarkable ways. The image of the grandmother hiding in our bushes stuck with everyone. That's the detail people can't shake. An elderly woman forced to flee her own home on a night meant for celebration, hiding outside because the inside was no longer safe. That image alone feels unreal, like something out of a nightmare, except it happened in real life, on our street. Afterward, the neighborhood never felt the same. Even if nothing else ever happened there again, the knowledge stayed. The understanding that something that horrific could unfold silently, while people nearby were distracted by fireworks and TV countdowns, changed how safety felt. It broke the illusion that violence announces itself loudly enough for you to prepare. It also changed how New Year's felt. That holiday is supposed to represent fresh starts, hope, the idea that something better is coming. For my family, it became tied to the knowledge that a new year can begin with absolute devastation, and that joy and horror can exist side by side without touching each other at all. The fact that I wasn't there almost makes it worse in a strange way. I learned about it afterward, piecing together the story through fragments and reactions. It felt like learning about a parallel reality that had unfolded just out of reach, something that brushed against my life without me witnessing it directly. What stays with me isn't just the violence, as awful as that is. It's the timing, the contrast. Fireworks on TV while a family is being destroyed next door. People celebrating while a grandmother is hiding for her life in our yard. A mother trying to do something kind for the holiday and unintentionally setting the stage for tragedy. There's no clean lesson in it, no easy explanation. Mental illness, family decisions, timing, chance, everything colliding in the worst possible way. It's one of those stories that reminds you how thin the walls are between ordinary life and catastrophe. How easily something unimaginable can happen without warning, even in places you consider safe. And how sometimes the scariest part isn't just what happened, but how close it was, how quiet it was, and how little anyone could have done once it started. That new year didn't just mark the start of another calendar year for my family. It marked the moment we understood deeply and permanently that horror doesn't wait for the right setting, and it doesn't care what day it is. She met him the way people often meet someone who later turns out to be a nightmare. Quietly, without warning, without any obvious red flags. At first, he seemed normal enough, maybe a little intense, maybe a little possessive in ways that felt flattering at the time, but nothing that immediately set off alarms. People rarely marry someone they believe is dangerous. You marry the version of them they show you when they want to be loved. They got married, and for a while, life moved forward the way it's supposed to. A home, a routine. Kids adapting to a new adult in their world. From the outside, it looked like a blended family trying to find its footing. But behind closed doors, things began to shift. His behavior changed in ways that were subtle at first and then impossible to ignore. Control crept in slowly. Anger flared over small things. The intensity that once felt like devotion turned into something darker. Eventually, she realized she couldn't stay. The divorce wasn't easy, but she believed that leaving would end it. That once the paperwork was signed and the separation was official, he would fade into the past like so many bad chapters do. She underestimated how deeply unstable he really was. He didn't let go. What followed was over a year of stalking that wore her down piece by piece. It wasn't constant enough to feel dramatic at first. It came in waves, just enough to keep her on edge. She would notice things that didn't make sense. Mail that had clearly been opened before she saw it. Letters missing. Packages that never arrived. At first, she thought it was a mistake, a postal issue, something harmless. Then her daughter's toys started disappearing. Not big things, not obvious valuables. Small personal items, a favorite doll, a stuffed animal that always stayed on the bed. Things that couldn't have been misplaced easily, things that had emotional weight. That was when fear really set in. Someone wasn't just watching her. Someone was entering her space, touching her children's belongings, leaving without a trace. She checked the locks, changed routines, asked neighbors to keep an eye out. Still, nothing explained how these things were happening. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no damaged doors. The house looked exactly the same every time she came home, except for the feeling that it had been violated. That feeling became unbearable. Eventually, she installed a security camera. It wasn't sophisticated, just something to give her peace of mind. She didn't expect what it would show her. Part of her still hoped she was imagining things, that there would be nothing there, and she could finally tell herself she was safe. She was wrong. The footage showed her ex-husband sneaking into the house. He moved through it like he belonged there, like it was still his. He knew where things were. He knew how to avoid making noise. He came and went without urgency, without panic, as if he had all the time in the world. Watching it later, knowing he had been inside while she and her children slept, was almost worse than if he had been caught in the moment. She went to the police. She documented everything. Reports were filed. Warnings were issued. But the system moves slowly, and fear moves fast. Restraining orders are words on paper. They don't stop someone who has already decided that rules no longer apply to them. Despite everything, she tried to move on. She started dating again, cautiously, carefully. She didn't advertise it. She didn't bring people around her kids right away. Eventually, she met someone who felt safe, kind, stable. Someone who understood what she had been through and didn't push her to rush. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of normalcy returning. That was when the situation escalated. Her ex-husband found out. No one knows exactly how. Maybe he was still watching. Maybe he followed her. Maybe someone said something without realizing the danger. However it happened, the result was immediate and terrifying. One night, her new boyfriend's camper was set on fire. It wasn't an accident. The fire destroyed it completely. Everything inside was lost. The message was clear enough that it didn't need to be spoken. This wasn't about jealousy anymore. This was about punishment, about control, about making sure she understood that no matter where she went or who she tried to build a life with, he could still reach her. She was terrified. Police were involved again. Investigations were opened. But again, time dragged on, and the damage had already been done. Everyone hoped the fire would be the worst of it. That it was a final, desperate act meant to scare. Not a step toward something worse. 2 weeks later, her new boyfriend was murdered. There was no ambiguity, no question about what had happened. A man lost his life because he had the misfortune of loving someone whose past refused to stay buried. The ex-husband had crossed the final line, the one that can't be uncrossed. Stalking turned into arson. Arson turned into murder. The fallout was devastating. A family was shattered again. Children lost someone they had begun to trust. A woman who had already survived one terrifying relationship was forced to confront the reality that leaving didn't make her safe. It only changed the shape of the danger. Grief mixed with guilt in ways that were impossible to untangle. She hadn't caused what happened, but that knowledge doesn't erase the pain of wondering if different choices could have led to a different outcome. What makes this story especially disturbing isn't just the violence, as horrifying as it is. It's the slow progression, the way it unfolded step by step, giving just enough warning to create fear, but not enough intervention to stop it in time. It shows how stalking isn't just harassment. It's a warning sign, a countdown, a pattern that too often gets dismissed until it's too late. Her ex-husband didn't snap in a single moment. He unraveled over time, growing bolder as he realized he could get away with more and more. Each boundary he crossed without consequence made the next one easier. By the time he committed murder, the signs had been there for over a year, written in stolen mail, missing toys, and grainy security footage. For those who knew her, the story changed how they saw everything. It changed how they thought about restraining orders, about safety, about how fragile normal life really is when someone becomes obsessed. It reinforced a truth that's hard to accept. Sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who already know you best. Even now, the details of the case are hard to talk about. Not because they're unknown, but because they're too clear. There's no mystery to soften the blow. No unanswered questions that allow for speculation. Just a straight line from obsession to violence. She survived, but survival came at an unimaginable cost. And for everyone who heard the story afterward, it left a lingering fear. Not a loud, constant fear, but a quiet one that sits in the back of your mind. The awareness that leaving is often the most dangerous moment. That stalking is never harmless. That when someone refuses to let go, the threat doesn't disappear just because a relationship ends. It's a story that doesn't feel like it belongs in real life, but it does. It happened. And that's what makes it so unsettling. I first heard this story sitting around a campfire at a sleepaway camp in upstate New York. It wasn't a casual summer camp either. It was a training camp for rescued border collies, a place called Glen Highland Farm, tucked away off Bemis Road. The kind of place surrounded by trees, open land, and long stretches of quiet where sound carries farther than it should. At night, when the dogs settle and the wind moves through the hills, the area feels older than it looks. That night, we were sitting close to the fire, tired from the day's work, clothes smelling like smoke and dirt. The dogs were kenneled nearby, mostly calm, the way trained working dogs are. Someone suggested telling stories, and eventually one of the trainers began talking about Old Man Bemis. He said the land around the camp had a history most people didn't know. Bemis Road wasn't just a name. It belonged to a man who had lived there a long time ago. A man who, according to local legend, had been accused of murders he never committed. The storyteller said Old Man Bemis had been blamed when fear took over the community. People needed someone to point at, someone to punish, and Bemis was convenient. Whether he was strange, reclusive, or just unlucky, no one really knew anymore. What mattered was that once the accusations started, they never stopped. What happened to him was brutal. They didn't kill him once. They tried to kill him again and again. According to the story, he was stabbed first, left bleeding, but alive. When that didn't finish him, they beat him. When he still lived, they dragged him out and hanged him. Somehow he survived that too. The crowd grew more frantic, more convinced that his survival meant something unnatural. They stoned him. Then, finally, they burned him alive, and even then the storyteller said he didn't die the way a man should. The story paused there, and the fire cracked loudly, sending sparks into the dark. The dogs shifted, some lifting their heads, ears twitching. The storyteller leaned forward and told us that Old Man Bemis had been buried in the cemetery across from the camp, the same cemetery we all passed without thinking whenever we drove in or out. Then he said something that made the air change. He said that earlier that night, before the campfire, he had gone to that cemetery alone. He said he wanted to let Old Man Bemis speak, to let him finally say what he never got to say while he was alive. As he kept talking, his voice started to change. At first, it was subtle. Just a shift in tone, a slight roughness that hadn't been there before. Then his posture changed. He hunched forward, shoulders tense, hands gripping his knees. When he spoke again, it didn't sound like him anymore. I didn't do it. The words came out low and strained, like they were being forced through him rather than spoken by him. A few people laughed nervously, assuming it was part of the act, but no one else spoke. The firelight flickered across his face, and his expression looked wrong, fixed in a way that didn't match the storytelling mood from moments before. I didn't do it, the voice said again. He described the accusations, the fear, the rage of the people who turned on him. But now it wasn't being told like a story. It sounded like a confession, or maybe a plea. He spoke about the pain, about being hurt again and again, about knowing he was innocent and realizing it didn't matter. The scariest part wasn't the words themselves. It was the way they came out. Flat, empty, exhausted, like someone who had already said them 1,000 times and knew no one would listen. When the story reached its end, the storyteller stopped abruptly. He took a deep breath, straightened up, and said calmly that he was letting the spirit go, that Old Man Bemis had been heard. For a second, there was silence. Then every dog in the camp started barking at once, not playful barking, not excited barking. It was loud, frantic, unified, like an alarm had gone off. Dozens of dogs barking in the dark, all at the same time, all facing the same general direction. The sound echoed across the field and into the trees, bouncing back at us in waves. No one laughed then. The storyteller didn't smile. He just sat there, breathing hard, staring into the fire. Eventually the dogs settled, one by one, but the quiet that followed felt heavier than before, like something had passed through and left the space changed. Later, people tried to explain it away. Dogs are sensitive. Group barking spreads easily. Campfire stories get dramatic. But no one forgot the timing, the way his voice changed. The exact moment the dogs reacted, right after he said he released the spirit. I don't know what to believe about Old Man Bemis. I don't know if there was ever a real man, or real murders, or real injustice buried under that land. But I do know this. That night didn't feel like a performance. It felt like something old had been invited to speak, if only for a moment. And when it was finished, the dogs knew something we didn't. I heard this story while working at a summer camp, the kind of place where people talk late into the night once the kids are asleep. Conversations drift from jokes to personal stories, and sometimes, without warning, someone says something that changes the mood completely. This was one of those moments. One of the girls I worked with told me a story about her family, and from the first sentence I could tell it wasn't going to be something light or forgettable. She started by talking about her uncle. Years ago, when he was still a teenager, he accepted a ride from a man he didn't know very well. At the time, it didn't seem like a big deal. People hitched rides more easily back then, especially young people. There wasn't the same constant fear drilled into everyone the way there is now. You didn't automatically assume the worst about strangers. Sometimes you just needed to get somewhere, and someone offered help. Her uncle got into the car. At first, nothing seemed wrong. The man was calm, friendly enough. Just another adult offering a ride. But as they drove, her uncle started to feel uneasy. He couldn't point to one specific thing. It wasn't a threat or an obvious red flag. It was just a feeling, a sense that something wasn't right. The kind of instinct that creeps in quietly, without explanation. That feeling kept growing. He realized slowly and uncomfortably that getting into that car might have been a mistake. His body reacted before his mind fully caught up. His heart started racing. His thoughts became focused on one thing, getting out. He watched the road carefully, waiting for any chance. When the car slowed at a stop sign, he didn't hesitate. He opened the door and jumped out. He didn't look back. He didn't try to explain. He just ran. He didn't care how strange it looked or whether the driver shouted after him. All that mattered was distance. Space between himself and that car. Space between himself and the man behind the wheel. At the time, he didn't know how close he had come to something far worse. He just knew he had escaped a situation that felt wrong. Life went on. The moment faded into memory. It became one of those strange stories you tell yourself years later, wondering if you had overreacted or embarrassed yourself for no reason. People second-guess their instincts all the time, especially when nothing bad seems to come from acting on them. Then, sometime later, he saw the man on the news. That's when everything changed. The face on the screen was the same face from the car, the same man who had offered him a ride, the same man he had jumped away from at a stop sign, the same calm expression, now paired with words that made his stomach drop. The man was John Wayne Gacy. By then, the truth about Gacy was coming out. He wasn't just a criminal. He wasn't just dangerous. He was a serial killer who had raped and murdered at least 33 teenage boys between 1972 and 1978. Some of them were buried beneath his house. Others were discarded like trash. Many of them were close in age to her uncle at the time he accepted that ride. Her uncle realized how close he had come to being one of those victims. That kind of realization doesn't fade. It doesn't become an interesting fact you share casually. It changes the way you see your entire past. Every detail suddenly feels heavier. The decision to jump out of the car wasn't just smart. It wasn't just lucky. It was the difference between living a full life and becoming another name on a list of the dead. When my coworker told the story, there was a quiet pause afterward. No one knew what to say. It's hard to respond to something like that without feeling shaken. The idea that someone you know, someone standing right in front of you, is only alive because they trusted a feeling they couldn't explain is unsettling. But the story didn't end there. As she kept talking, she mentioned something else that made the entire thing feel even stranger, almost unreal. She explained that her aunt was married to Patton Oswalt. That alone felt like an odd connection, but then she added another layer. Her aunt was Michelle McNamara. Michelle McNamara wasn't just a writer with an interest in crime. She was deeply invested in one of the most terrifying unsolved cases in American history. She spent years researching, documenting, and obsessing over a serial offender who came to be known as the Golden State Killer. Her work wasn't casual. It was detailed, relentless, and driven by a need to understand and expose someone who had evaded justice for decades. She wrote a book called I'll Be Gone in the Dark, which brought renewed public attention to the case. The book didn't just retell old facts. It connected patterns, highlighted overlooked details, and kept pressure on law enforcement and the public to keep looking. Many believe that the attention generated by her work, played a major role in finally identifying and capturing the Golden State Killer years later. So here was this one family, connected in two completely different ways to two of the most notorious serial killers in American history. One connection came from a near miss, a split-second decision to jump from a car. The other came from years of obsessive research, writing, and dedication to exposing a monster hiding in plain sight. When I stepped back and thought about it, what struck me most was how thin the line was in both stories. Her uncle's life was saved by instinct. No evidence, no proof, just a feeling strong enough to make him act without hesitation. If he had ignored it, if he had told himself he was being silly or paranoid, the outcome could have been completely different. Michelle McNamara's work, on the other hand, came from refusing to let something go, from trusting that patterns mattered, from believing that even when a case went cold, it wasn't truly over. That persistence helped bring a killer into the light after decades of silence. Both stories revolve around listening. Listening to instinct, listening to details, listening to the quiet voice that says something isn't right. What makes the uncle's story especially haunting is imagining the alternative. Imagining him staying in that car just a little longer. Imagining the stop sign passing without action. Imagining how easy it would have been for Gacy to continue driving, smiling, gaining trust. Many of his victims were lured in exactly that way. Friendly conversation, offers of help, a sense of normalcy that hid something monstrous underneath. The idea that Gacy could have been anywhere, offering rides, blending in, pretending to be safe, is terrifying. It reminds you how vulnerable people can be, especially young people, who don't yet know how dangerous the world can be. It also reminds you how predators rely on politeness, hesitation, and doubt. They count on people not wanting to make a scene, not wanting to seem rude, not wanting to be wrong. Her uncle broke that pattern by acting. The fact that he later recognized the man on the news must have been surreal. Seeing a familiar face framed by headlines about murder and abuse, realizing that a casual interaction almost turned into something unspeakable. That kind of moment can replay in your mind endlessly, each time ending differently depending on the choice you imagine making. As for Michelle McNamara, there's something tragic and powerful about her story as well. She dedicated so much of herself to understanding evil, to documenting it, to refusing to let victims be forgotten. She helped push a case forward that many believed would never be solved. Her work mattered. It made a difference. When my coworker finished telling all of this, the night felt heavier. It wasn't just one scary story. It was a reminder of how closely danger can brush past people without them realizing it at the time. How lives can be shaped by moments that seem small when they happen. How survival sometimes comes down to instinct, and justice sometimes comes down to obsession and persistence. It also made me think about how interconnected these stories are. One family touched by horror from two different angles. One through chance and escape. The other through investigation and exposure. Both tied to men who lived double lives, hiding their violence behind normal appearances. What stays with me the most is imagining how different everything could have been if her uncle had ignored that feeling in his gut. If he had stayed quiet. If he had stayed seated. One decision, one stop sign, one open car door changed everything. That's what makes this story so unsettling. Not just the killers involved, not just the crimes, but the randomness of survival. The way someone can walk away from something they didn't even fully understand at the time, only to realize later how close they were to disappearing forever. It's a reminder that sometimes the scariest stories aren't about what happened, but about what almost happened and how easily no one would have ever known. This happened during what was supposed to be a calm, ordinary boating trip on the Norfolk Broads. It's the kind of place people go to slow down. Flat water, quiet mornings, reeds moving in the wind, boats drifting past each other at a gentle pace. Nothing about it feels dangerous. Nothing about it feels like the setting for something horrific. I was there with my sister. We were sharing time on the water, doing normal vacation things, swimming, relaxing, enjoying the stillness. It was the sort of environment where you let your guard down without even realizing you're doing it. On a nearby boat was a man, his girlfriend, and her daughter. From the outside, they looked like just another family on holiday, a couple with a child, moving slowly along the waterways, tying up for the night like everyone else. There was nothing about them that stood out. No raised voices, no visible conflict, no sense that anything was wrong. That's the part that still bothers me. Because while everyone else was drifting, relaxing, laughing, something unimaginable was happening just a short distance away. At some point during the trip, the man killed the woman. From what later came out, it wasn't immediately treated as murder in the traditional sense. It was described as manslaughter. The explanation given was that the couple had been trying to act out sexual scenarios inspired by 50 Shades of Grey, and that things had gone wrong. However it happened, however it was framed legally, the result was the same. The woman was dead, and her daughter was still there. Instead of calling for help, instead of alerting authorities, instead of ending the nightmare he had created, the man made a decision that still feels deeply disturbing. He hid the truth. He told the girl that her mother had left during the night, that she had gone away, that she wasn't coming back, but in a way that didn't raise alarm. For 6 days, he stayed on that boat with the girl. 6 days. That number is hard to wrap your head around. 6 days of meals, 6 days of conversation, 6 days of pretending everything was normal, while the girl believed her mother had simply disappeared. He maintained that lie while moving through one of the calmest landscapes imaginable, surrounded by other people who had no idea what had already happened. The girl trusted him. She had no reason not to. He was the adult who was supposed to be protecting her. She had no way of knowing that she was sharing space with someone who had just killed her mother. Eventually, after nearly a week of living inside that lie, the man made another decision. He decided to drown himself. What makes this even harder to accept is how close all of this was to us. On the day he killed himself, I was with my sister. She was swimming in the water. I was nearby, watching her, relaxed, completely unaware. We were enjoying the day, laughing, talking, being present in our own small world. He drowned himself not 30 feet away from us. 30 feet. That's the length of a small room, a few steps, a short distance you could cover in seconds. And yet we noticed nothing. No splashing, no shouting. No sign that someone was ending their life right there in the same water we were sharing. We somehow missed it entirely. That realization still makes my stomach drop. The idea that something so extreme could happen so close without us noticing is deeply unsettling. It forces you to confront how limited your awareness really is, even when you think you're paying attention. At the time, we had no idea anything was wrong. The boats around us looked the same as they always had. People went about their business. The water moved gently. The world stayed quiet. The girl was left alone. Thankfully, she was found before it was too late. She survived. That fact matters more than anything else in this story. Whatever trauma she carries, she at least lived. Someone noticed something was wrong. Authorities intervened. She wasn't left abandoned on the water. But that doesn't erase what she went through. Imagine being a child, told your mother left without explanation. Spending nearly a week adjusting to that loss without understanding it. Then suddenly being pulled into a reality where the truth comes crashing down all at once. Learning that your mother didn't leave, that she was killed, that the person you trusted had lied to you the entire time, that he then chose to die as well. That kind of trauma doesn't resolve neatly. It doesn't fade just because the immediate danger ends. It becomes part of you. We only found out the full story later that night. We were back on land, winding down, when the news came on. The report talked about a woman found dead on a boat in the Norfolk Broads. It talked about a man who had stayed with a child for days before killing himself in the water. It talked about the investigation, the timeline, the details. As we watched, a sick realization crept in. The boat they showed on the screen was the boat across from us, the exact boat. The one we had been anchored near, the one we had passed without a second thought, the one that had been sitting quietly while everything unfolded. That moment was pure horror. Not the dramatic kind you see in movies, but the slow, cold kind that settles into your chest. The kind that makes you feel disconnected from your own body for a few seconds. The kind that makes you replay the day over and over, searching for something you missed. We were horrified, shocked, speechless. The thought that we had been swimming, relaxing, enjoying ourselves while a man drowned himself just a short distance away is something that still doesn't feel real. It creates a strange sense of guilt, even though there was nothing we could have done if we didn't know. You start questioning your awareness, your instincts, your sense of safety. The scariest part for me isn't just the crime itself, though that is horrifying enough. It's the closeness of it. The fact that life and death were happening side by side in the same peaceful setting. The fact that tragedy can unfold silently, without announcing itself, without demanding attention. The Norfolk Broads are supposed to feel safe. They're open, visible, shared spaces. And yet this happened in plain sight, hidden by normalcy. It made me realize how easily we assume we'd notice something wrong. We believe danger will look dangerous. That distress will be loud. That death will be obvious. But sometimes it isn't. Sometimes it happens quietly, beneath the surface, while the rest of the world keeps floating by. I think about that girl often. About how calm the water must have looked to her, about how confusing those days must have been, about how betrayal and loss became tangled together in a way no child should ever have to experience. And I think about how close we were, about how easily we could have gone home that day without ever knowing what had happened nearby. About how many other times people live right next to tragedy, without realizing it until later. That's what makes this story stay with me. Not just the violence, not just the death, but the idea that horror doesn't always come with warning signs. Sometimes it sits quietly in the same space as ordinary life. Sometimes you're swimming, laughing, watching someone you love enjoy the water, while just a few yards away, someone else is making a final, irreversible decision. And you don't hear a thing. When I was 12 years old, in the town where I grew up, It's strange how some memories from childhood blur together while others stay painfully sharp. This one never faded. Even now, I can close my eyes and feel exactly what that day felt like part of me is still there, standing in the street trying to understand something far too big and violent for a kid to process. Our neighbor and friend was shot dead that day. His name was Willie Morrison. He wasn't just someone who lived nearby. He was someone we knew, someone our family cared about, the kind of person who made a place feel safer just by being part of it. He was friendly, familiar, and steady, the kind of adult you don't think twice about trusting. The man who killed him was named Tom Leask. At the time, that name meant nothing more to me than a face I recognized. That's one of the hardest parts to explain to people who weren't there. Tom Leask wasn't some stranger who appeared out of nowhere. He was part of our daily life. He worked occasionally at a small convenience store in town, the kind of place that sold candy, soda, and snacks. It also happened to be the school bus stop. Almost every morning, we would stop there before school. We bought candy from him. We joked. We stood at the counter like kids do, impatient and loud and careless. Our family knew him. Not closely, but enough. Enough to wave, enough to talk. Enough that his face didn't raise alarms in anyone's mind. Nothing about him felt dangerous then. That day started like so many others. I was 12, full of energy, bouncing around town with my brother and some friends. We weren't doing anything special. Just moving from place to place, killing time, enjoying the freedom kids have when adults aren't hovering over them. We didn't have phones. We didn't have instant updates. The world felt smaller, and we felt untouchable inside it. Then we heard gunshots. At first, none of us really understood what we were hearing. It didn't immediately register as something real. Loud noises can mean a lot of things. Fireworks, backfiring engines, construction. But something about it felt wrong. The sound echoed in a way that made my stomach tighten. Instead of running away, we did what kids often do when they don't understand danger yet. We ran toward it. I think about that decision a lot. How natural it felt at the time. Curiosity outweighed fear. Adrenaline overpowered logic. We wanted to see what was happening, to make sense of the noise. None of us truly believed we were running toward something deadly. By the time we got closer, chaos was already unfolding. We saw Tom Leask driving an Army surplus tractor with a front-end loader. It looked unreal, like something out of a movie or a nightmare. Heavy machinery doesn't belong tearing through a small town like that. It didn't fit the setting. The streets we played on weren't meant for destruction. He drove that machine straight into a municipal building. We watched it happen. The sound of metal crashing into brick and concrete was overwhelming. It wasn't just loud, it was violent, like the town itself was being attacked. Dust and debris filled the air. Windows shattered. The building buckled under the force. I remember standing there, frozen, trying to understand how everything had escalated so fast. Then he moved again. After damaging multiple buildings, he drove the tractor toward his own house. We followed from a distance, not close enough to intervene, but close enough to see. Close enough that the images burned into my memory. He set his house on fire. Flames climbed quickly. Smoke poured into the sky. Fire has a way of drawing attention, of making everything feel urgent and final. Watching someone burn down their own home is deeply unsettling. It felt like watching a person erase themselves, severing their last tie to normal life. Then he ran. He fled into the woods. Just like that, he was gone. The sounds faded. The destruction stopped moving. What remained was confusion, smoke, damaged buildings, and a town full of people trying to understand what had just happened. Only later did the full truth sink in. Willie Morrison was dead. The man who killed him wasn't some faceless criminal from the news. It was Tom, the guy who sold us candy, the guy who stood behind the counter at the bus stop, the guy our parents had spoken to without fear. That realization hit hard. It reshaped how I understood the world. Up until then, danger felt distant. Bad people were supposed to look bad. They were supposed to come from outside your life, outside your town, outside your routines. This shattered that belief completely. The weight of it didn't fully hit me all at once. At 12 years old, your mind tries to protect itself. I remember feeling shocked, confused, excited in a horrible way because something dramatic had happened, and then guilty for feeling that excitement at all. It wasn't until later, much later, that the fear and sadness settled in. I started thinking about Willie, about his family, about how sudden it all was. One moment he was alive, part of the community, and the next he was gone, killed by someone everyone thought they knew. There was no warning that any of us could see, no clear line where things went wrong. I also couldn't stop thinking about Tom, how someone can exist so normally in a community, interacting with kids, selling candy, standing at a bus stop, and then suddenly become capable of something so violent. It forced me to realize that people carry things inside them that you can't see. That familiarity doesn't equal safety. After that day, everything felt different. The convenience store didn't feel the same. Standing at the bus stop felt strange. The streets felt less innocent. I became more aware of how fragile order really is, how quickly it can collapse. The idea that we had been so close, that we had watched it happen, that we had run toward gunshots instead of away from them, stayed with me. There's a particular kind of fear that comes from realizing how unprepared you were, how easily things could have gone even worse, how we were lucky, in a twisted way, that we weren't closer, that we weren't caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. As an adult, I understand more about mental illness, violence, and the complexity of human behavior. But understanding doesn't erase the emotional impact. It doesn't undo the fact that a good man died, that a town was shaken, that a group of kids saw something they never should have had to see. Willie Morrison didn't deserve what happened to him. He was a great guy. That's how everyone remembers him. Kind, familiar. A presence that made the neighborhood feel like home. Losing someone like that leaves a hole that doesn't close easily. And Tom Leask will always exist in my memory as a reminder of how wrong assumptions can be. Not as a monster from the start, but as someone who moved among us unnoticed, until the moment he didn't. That day marked the end of a certain kind of innocence for me. It was the moment I learned that violence doesn't always come with warning signs, that people you recognize can become dangerous, and that safety is never as guaranteed as it feels. Even now, thinking back on it, what scares me most isn't just the destruction or the death. It's how close it all was, how normal everything felt right before it happened, how easily we could have been closer, how we watched history unfold without understanding that it would stay with us for the rest of our lives. Some events don't just happen around you. They change you. They settle into your memory and reshape how you see the world. This was one of those events for me. And no matter how much time passes, that day will always be there, clear and unmovable, a reminder of how quickly everything can break and how deeply those breaks can cut. Sorry to pause for just a moment. If this is your first time here, welcome. I hope you're enjoying the calm so far. If you'd like more nights like this, true stories, gentle rain, no interruptions, please subscribe to Lacuna Noir. It really helps me keep creating these peaceful experiences for you. And tap the bell so you're here every time a new story arrives in the dark. Now, back to the story. In 2016, something shifted in the United States that many people are still trying to fully understand. For some, it felt like a political loss. For others, it felt like something far more unsettling, like watching the foundations of a system you believed in begin to crack in real time. Looking back, it didn't feel like a single cause led to the outcome of that election, but rather a convergence of forces that built on each other until the result became unavoidable. One of the most widely discussed elements was the role of Russia. In the years since the election, U.S. intelligence agencies and multiple investigations concluded that Russia carried out a broad influence campaign aimed at the American electorate. This included the use of bots, troll farms, and fake social media accounts designed to amplify division, spread misinformation, and inflame existing tensions. These efforts weren't subtle. They targeted race, immigration, religion, gender, and political identity, often posing as Americans on all sides of the political spectrum. At the same time, there were direct hacking efforts. Email systems connected to political organizations and individuals were breached, and selected materials were released publicly in ways that maximized political damage. While voting machines themselves were not proven to have been altered, the idea that a foreign power had interfered in the democratic process deeply shook public trust. For many Americans, it felt like a line had been crossed, even if the full consequences were difficult to measure. All of this unfolded in a political environment already under immense strain. The presidency of Barack Obama had marked a major moment in American history. He was the first African-American president, and under his administration, the country had recovered from the 2008 financial crisis, expanded healthcare access, and regained a degree of global stability. But his presidency also provoked an intense backlash. For some Americans, Obama represented progress. For others, he became a symbol into which resentment, fear, and racism were projected. That backlash didn't disappear when his term ended. It intensified. By 2016, it had become clear that there was a significant portion of the electorate that felt alienated by cultural and demographic changes in the country. These voters were receptive to messages that framed progress as loss and diversity as threat. Political rhetoric that appealed to grievance, nostalgia, and anger found fertile ground. The idea that America had been taken away from certain groups became a powerful narrative, even if it wasn't grounded in reality. Into this environment stepped Donald Trump. Trump presented himself as an outsider, someone who would disrupt the political establishment. He marketed his wealth as proof of independence, claiming he couldn't be bought and wasn't beholden to traditional donors. For his supporters, this image was appealing. For critics, it raised questions. Over the years, journalists and investigators had examined Trump's business history, including bankruptcies, opaque finances, and relationships with foreign investors. Allegations circulated about money laundering and connections to organized crime, including Russian-linked figures, though many of these claims remained unproven or contested. Still, the lack of transparency surrounding his finances fueled suspicion and concern. What mattered politically was perception. Trump's campaign benefited from constant media attention. Outrage drove coverage, and coverage drove visibility. Statements that would have ended the careers of traditional politicians instead seemed to strengthen his brand. Each controversy reinforced the idea that he was different, that he was fighting the system, even as he relied heavily on it. Meanwhile, the Democratic Party was struggling with its own internal fractures. The Democratic National Committee entered the 2016 primary season divided between establishment leadership and a growing progressive base. Many voters believed that the DNC had unfairly favored Hillary Clinton over other candidates. Leaked emails appeared to confirm that party officials had discussed strategies that disadvantaged her primary opponent. Whether or not the primary outcome would have been different without that interference became almost beside the point. The damage was done. Trust was broken. For a segment of progressive voters, the process felt rigged. Some became disillusioned. Others became angry. A number of them disengaged entirely. They didn't see Clinton as an inspiring candidate. To them, she represented the same political establishment they were already frustrated with. The argument that she was the lesser evil failed to motivate people who felt ignored and dismissed. There was also a widespread assumption that Trump could not win. Polls predicted a Clinton victory. Media narratives treated Trump's candidacy as a spectacle rather than a serious threat. This created a dangerous complacency. Many Democratic voters believed the election was essentially decided. Some stayed home. Others voted third party as a form of protest. The idea that their individual vote didn't matter became a self-fulfilling prophecy. When the results came in, the shock was immediate. Trump lost the popular vote but won the Electoral College, becoming president. For millions of Americans, it felt unreal. For others, it felt like vindication. For many, it felt like a warning. In the aftermath, attention returned to Russia's role in the election. Investigations examined contacts between Trump campaign officials and Russian figures. While no definitive proof emerged that Trump knowingly conspired with the Russian government. The volume of contacts, the openness to foreign assistance, and Trump's own unusually favorable rhetoric toward Russia raised serious concerns. To critics, he appeared compromised. To supporters, these concerns were dismissed as partisan attacks. The term Russian puppet became shorthand for a deeper fear, that American democracy could be manipulated not just from within, but from outside its borders, and that political leaders might be willing participants, whether out of self-interest, negligence, or ego. What made the situation especially frightening was how many weaknesses were exposed at once. Social media platforms proved vulnerable to manipulation. Political institutions showed signs of internal decay. Racial and cultural divisions were exploited with precision. Voter apathy and cynicism proved just as powerful as outright suppression. None of these elements alone would have been enough. Together, they created the conditions for an outcome that felt both shocking and, in hindsight, disturbingly logical. For many people, the fear wasn't just about Trump as an individual. It was about what his rise revealed. That large segments of the population could be mobilized through misinformation. That democratic norms could be eroded slowly, often legally, without dramatic coups or obvious violence. That truth itself could become negotiable. The 2016 election became a case study in modern influence warfare, institutional fragility, and the consequences of disengagement. It showed how democracy doesn't always collapse with force. Sometimes it erodes quietly through apathy, division, and the normalization of behavior that once would have been unacceptable. Even years later, people continue to argue over responsibility. Was it Russia's interference, racism and backlash, democratic infighting, media failure, voter complacency? The uncomfortable answer is that it was all of it. That's what makes it frightening. There was no single villain, no simple explanation. Just a system stressed at every point, pushed until it bent in ways many believed it couldn't. The result wasn't just the election of a controversial president. It was a loss of faith for millions of people who realized that the safeguards they relied on were weaker than they thought. For some, 2016 marked the beginning of a long political awakening. For others, it marked a deepening of distrust that hasn't healed. The fear wasn't just about who won, but about how easily it happened, and how vulnerable the future might be if those lessons were ignored. In that sense, the election didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a warning. In the tiny village where I grew up, a place so small that everyone knows everyone else, and every decision feels personal. It wasn't the kind of place that made national news. Most people outside of it wouldn't even recognize the name. Life there moved slowly, shaped by routine, tradition, and a quiet acceptance that things were the way they were, and probably always would be. One of those unchangeable things was the estuary. To get across it, there was only one option: a boat. Not a private one you could choose freely, but a service owned by a single multimillionaire. The ride itself took about 20 minutes. It wasn't especially scenic or pleasant. It was just necessary. And it was ridiculously expensive. Everyone in the village knew it. Everyone complained about it. Everyone paid anyway because there was no alternative. For years, people talked about how much sense it would make to build a bridge. A bridge would save time. It would save money. It would make daily life easier for people who had to cross regularly for work, school, or basic errands. But talk never turned into action. The cost was always cited as the problem, or the permits, or environmental concerns, or politics. There was always a reason nothing happened. Then we got a mayor who didn't accept that. He wasn't perfect, and not everyone liked him, but he was stubborn in a way that felt refreshing. He openly criticized the boat system. He pointed out how absurd it was that an entire village was effectively trapped by a single, privately owned service. He pushed the idea of building a bridge seriously, not as a vague dream, but as a real project. Slowly, he got people behind him. Not everyone, of course. In a small village, support is always divided. Some people were afraid of change. Some worried about taxes. Some didn't want to upset powerful interests. And then there was the boat owner, a multimillionaire whose wealth depended on the estuary remaining uncrossable by any other means. A bridge would destroy his monopoly overnight. The mayor never hid the fact that this was a battle. He talked openly about resistance, about pressure, about how difficult it was to move forward when money and influence were stacked against you. But he kept going anyway. He collected paperwork. He met with planners. He talked about funding options. For the first time, it felt like something might actually happen. Then one day, a group of men came to visit. They weren't locals. Everyone noticed that immediately. In a village that small, strangers stand out. These men were described as being very interested in the bridge project. They talked about funding, about investment, about helping make it happen. On the surface, it sounded like exactly what the mayor had been waiting for. They met with him that day, and that same day, he died. Officially, it was an accident. He fell off his balcony. That's what the report said. No witnesses, no clear explanation beyond gravity and bad luck. The kind of death that can be written off quickly if no one looks too closely. But nothing about it felt right. The timing alone was enough to make people uneasy. A group of unknown men arrive with intense interest in a controversial project. They meet privately with the mayor. Hours later, he's dead. And then, as if that wasn't enough, the entire file of paperwork for the bridge project disappears. Not misplaced. Not partially missing. Gone. The men left the village and were never seen again. No follow-up. No investigation that anyone heard about. No answers. Just silence, paperwork vanished, and a dead mayor. In a big city, maybe this would have been swallowed by noise. In a tiny village, it became a wound that never healed. People talked about it quietly. Not loudly, not publicly, just in kitchens, at shops, on walks home. Always with lowered voices. Always with the same conclusion, spoken or unspoken. This wasn't an accident. These men killed him. Whether that's true or not almost stopped mattering over time. What mattered was that no one believed the official story. Not really. The logic didn't sit right. Too many things lined up too perfectly. Too many benefits flowed in one direction after his death. The bridge project died with him. Without the paperwork, without leadership, without momentum, everything stalled. The mayor's replacement never pushed the idea again. Meetings stopped. Discussions faded. It was as if the bridge had never been a serious proposal at all. And the boat service continued. Every day, people paid the fare. Every week, money flowed to the same owner. Every year, the cost rose. Life went on, just as it always had, but with a new bitterness underneath it. Not just frustration, but resignation. The balcony where the mayor fell was never restored. That detail matters more than it might seem. The building still stands there, visibly damaged, unfinished. A constant reminder. People pass it every day. They see it. They know what it represents. Not just a death, but a message. Change is dangerous. Power wins. Don't push too hard. To this day, that broken balcony feels like a warning carved into the village itself. Children grow up hearing the story. Adults repeat it cautiously. Newcomers notice the ferry prices and ask why there isn't a bridge. And locals exchange looks before explaining. Some shrug it off. Some say it's complicated. Some just say, there used to be a plan. And then they stop talking. The scariest part isn't just the idea that the mayor may have been murdered. It's what came after. Or rather, what didn't come after. No justice, no answers, no accountability, just a quiet return to normal. As if the system corrected itself by removing the problem. It teaches a very specific lesson, that in some places, power doesn't need to be loud. It doesn't need threats or public violence. It just needs one carefully timed event, and everything falls back into place. The bridge was never built. And every time someone steps onto that boat and hands over their money for a 20-minute ride that shouldn't cost what it does, they're reminded of why. Not because they're told directly, but because the reminder is built into the village itself, into the missing bridge, into the broken balcony, into the silence around the men who came and left. That's why this story feels so unsettling. It doesn't end with sirens or trials or headlines. It ends with routine, with people adapting, with injustice becoming background noise. It's the kind of story that makes you realize how small communities can be just as vulnerable to corruption and fear as large ones, maybe even more so. When power is concentrated, when everyone depends on the same systems, when alternatives disappear quietly, it doesn't take much to keep things exactly the way they are. And so we keep paying the boat fares. Not because we want to, not because it makes sense, but because the last person who tried to change it ended up dead, and everyone remembers that, whether they admit it out loud or not. That balcony still stands, broken and unrepaired, a a silent monument to a bridge that never was and a truth no one was ever allowed to prove. My sister in 2011 in Denmark, at a time when fear was quietly spreading through the country, even though most people didn't yet understand why. Back then, the name Amagermanden wasn't widely known. There were rumors, scattered reports, uneasy conversations, but nothing solid enough for people to fully grasp the danger. The pattern hadn't been connected yet. The threat didn't have a face. My sister lived alone in her apartment. She was independent, careful, and not the type to take unnecessary risks. But like anyone, she lived her life without expecting something truly horrific to happen inside her own home. That night had started out well. She had gone out, had a good time, laughed, talked, enjoyed herself. She drank a little, enough to feel relaxed and tired, but not so much that she was out of control. When she came home, everything felt normal. She locked the door, got ready for bed, and climbed under the covers. The familiar sounds of her apartment surrounded her, the quiet hum of a place she knew well. She fell asleep quickly, the kind of sleep that comes easily after a long, pleasant night out. At some point later, she woke up. At first, she didn't know why. It wasn't a nightmare. It wasn't a sudden jolt of fear. It was a sound, a noise that didn't belong. Her brain registered it before she was fully awake. That subtle sense that something is wrong even before you understand what it is. She lay still in bed, listening. The apartment was supposed to be empty. She lived alone. No one should have been moving around, but she could hear something. Quiet sounds. Not loud enough to be obvious, but distinct enough to make her heart start beating faster. Instead of jumping out of bed, she did something very smart. She reached for her phone. She decided to call a friend just in case. It wasn't a dramatic decision. She didn't scream or panic yet. She just wanted someone on the line. Someone who could hear what was happening. Someone who could act if something went wrong. As the phone rang, she stayed still, listening to the faint noises coming from somewhere else in the apartment. Her friend answered. My sister whispered that she thought she heard someone in her apartment. She didn't know what was happening, but something felt off. Her friend stayed on the line listening, asking quiet questions, trying to keep her calm. Then, moments later, it happened. A man entered her bedroom, not bursting in, not running. He walked in slowly, calmly, like he belonged there. He was in his 40s. That detail stayed with her. Not a teenager. Not someone young and reckless. A grown man. Someone old enough to know exactly what he was doing. He didn't rush toward her. He didn't shout. He stood there, and he spoke softly. It's okay, he said, over and over again. It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you. Those words are chilling, because they weren't comforting. They weren't reassuring. They were wrong. No one who belongs in your bedroom in the middle of the night needs to say those things. No one who means no harm needs to explain themselves like that. My sister started screaming. She screamed at him to leave. She repeated it again and again. You have to leave now. Her voice was loud, panicked, desperate. Her body was shaking. Her heart was racing so hard it felt like it might burst. The man didn't move. He just stood there. He kept repeating that it was okay, that he wasn't going to hurt her. Calmly, almost gently, like he was trying to soothe a frightened animal rather than responding to a human being in terror. That calmness made it worse. There is something deeply unsettling about someone remaining composed while you are screaming at them to leave. It creates a sense of unreality, like the normal rules of interaction have broken down completely. My sister later said, That in that moment, she realized he wasn't reacting to her fear the way a normal person would. He wasn't surprised. He wasn't apologetic. He wasn't backing away. He was waiting. Still on the phone, my sister raised her voice and said something that likely saved her life. She told him she was on the phone with her friend. She said her friend had already called the police. And that changed everything. The man hesitated, just for a second. Then he turned and left the room. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He walked out the same quiet way he had entered. My sister jumped out of bed and slammed the door behind him, locking it as fast as she could. Her hands were shaking so badly she struggled with the lock. Her friend stayed on the phone, talking constantly, telling her to breathe, telling her help was on the way. Once the door was locked, my sister realized she was still in danger if the man was still inside the apartment. Gathering every bit of courage she had, she moved carefully toward the kitchen, keeping the phone pressed to her ear. That's when she saw them. All of her kitchen knives were laid out on the table, not scattered, not randomly placed. They were arranged neatly, in order. That image is burned into her memory. Someone had taken the time to go through her kitchen. Someone had selected the knives, placed them carefully, deliberately. That wasn't something done in a hurry. That wasn't panic. That was preparation. The meaning of it hit her all at once. This wasn't a drunk mistake. This wasn't someone who wandered into the wrong apartment. This wasn't confusion. This was intent. She broke down completely then. The fear shifted into something heavier, something colder. The realization that she had been asleep in her bed while a stranger stood in her kitchen, handling knives, arranging them, deciding something. The police arrived not long after. They searched the apartment. They took her statement. They checked the locks, the windows, every possible entry point. The man was gone. There was no immediate sign of where he had come from or where he had gone. At the time, it was treated as a terrifying home invasion. Serious, yes, but without the context that would come later. The man was described, the details were recorded, but there was no name, no identity, no larger story yet. Life moved on, but my sister didn't. She struggled with sleep after that. Every sound in the night felt threatening. Every creak of the apartment made her heart race. She double-checked locks. She kept lights on. She replayed the moment in her head over and over, especially the way he spoke, the way he stood there, the way he didn't react like a normal person would. Then, sometime later, she saw him on television. It wasn't immediate. It wasn't the next day. It was after the case had broken open, after the media finally connected the dots, after the public learned that Denmark had been dealing with a serial predator who had been operating quietly, slipping in and out of women's lives, attacking, raping, killing. She saw his face on the screen, and she knew. She recognized him instantly. The age, the face, the presence, the voice. There was no doubt in her mind. The man who had stood in her bedroom in the middle of the night, calmly telling her it was okay while she screamed at him to leave, was Amager Mandan. The realization was devastating. Everything changed in that moment. What had already been traumatic suddenly became something much worse. She wasn't just a victim of a break-in. She wasn't just unlucky. She had come face to face with a serial killer. She understood all at once what had almost happened. If she hadn't woken up, if she hadn't called her friend, if she hadn't screamed, if she hadn't said the police were on their way, if even one of those things had gone differently, she might not be alive. The knives on the table took on a new meaning. The calm voice, the refusal to leave, the way he waited. It all fit into a pattern that hadn't been visible at the time, but was horrifyingly clear in hindsight. For my sister, the aftermath was long and complicated. There is a specific kind of trauma that comes from realizing you narrowly escaped something fatal. It's not just fear, it's guilt, confusion, anger, a constant replaying of alternate outcomes. She questioned every decision she made that night, even the ones that saved her. She wondered why her apartment had been targeted. Why her? Why that night? Why she woke up when others hadn't? And there was another layer that made it even worse. At the time of the incident, she had been tipsy, not helpless, but relaxed, vulnerable in a way she hadn't chosen. The knowledge that someone had watched her, entered her space, and prepared weapons while she slept is something that never truly leaves you. Even years later, certain things still trigger memories for her. Unexpected noises at night, the feeling of being watched, men speaking softly in the dark, kitchens at night, knives laid out on counters, even innocently. What makes this story especially terrifying is how ordinary it started. A good night out, going home, going to bed, doing everything right, locking the door, living alone but safely. The danger didn't come from a dark alley or a risky decision. It came through her own door. And what chills me the most is knowing that at the time, no one knew who he was, and no one knew there was a serial killer operating in this way. Women didn't know what to watch out for. They didn't know the signs. They didn't know how close he might already be. My sister survived because of instinct, luck, and quick thinking. But survival doesn't mean escaping unscathed. It means carrying the knowledge of how close you came, forever. When she tells the story now, her voice stays steady, but there are moments where it catches, just slightly. Especially when she talks about the knives. Especially when she talks about his voice. Especially when she talks about recognizing him on television and realizing that her fear that night hadn't been an overreaction at all. It had been perfectly justified. She doesn't talk about it often, but when she does, it's not for drama. It's not for attention. It's because it still feels unreal that she is here to tell it at all. For me, hearing it changed the way I think about safety, about how thin the line is between ordinary life and unimaginable violence, about how predators don't always look frightening. Sometimes they look calm, reassuring, reasonable. Sometimes they stand in your bedroom and tell you everything is okay, while your body is screaming that nothing is. And sometimes the only reason you live to see their face on television later is because you woke up at exactly the right moment. This is one of those things that, even years later, still feels strange to say out loud because it touches parts of my childhood that were supposed to be safe. When you're young, adults feel permanent. Teachers feel especially untouchable, like they belong to a different category of people, separate from danger, separate from chaos. That illusion didn't survive very long for me. When I was in kindergarten, one of my teachers killed his boyfriend. I didn't understand it at the time, not really. I was too young to grasp what murder meant beyond the word itself. I just remember adults talking in hushed voices, parents whispering to each other, the sudden absence of someone who had been part of our daily routine. I don't remember how many times he stabbed him, only that it was violent, repeated, and intentional. That detail came later. It filtered through adult conversations I wasn't meant to fully hear. At that age, you don't separate a person into teacher and killer. You only know that someone who once smiled at you, helped you with letters and drawings, suddenly became something terrifying in the adult world. Even if no one explained it directly, the atmosphere changed. The classroom felt different. School felt less predictable. Something invisible had cracked. I didn't know it then, but that was probably the first time I learned that people can live double lives, that someone can play one role in public and carry something dark and uncontrollable inside them. It planted a seed of unease that never really went away. The second story is harder to talk about because it involves family. My adoptive aunt was a kind person, gentle, trusting, maybe too trusting. She was the kind of person who wanted to see the good in people, even when there were reasons to be careful. At some point, she started hanging out with a man who practiced Umbanda. At first, no one thought much of it. Different beliefs, different rituals, but people are allowed to believe what they want. That alone shouldn't have been dangerous, but something went wrong. Over time, my aunt changed. Not all at once, but gradually. She became quieter, more withdrawn, more confused. Later, it came out that she had been drugged and abused. The details were never discussed openly in front of me, but enough fragments surfaced that the picture became clear as I grew older. What happened to her wasn't spiritual exploration or harmless belief. It was exploitation. After that period, she wasn't the same person anymore. She started behaving in ways that scared my grandparents. She said things that didn't make sense. She seemed disconnected from reality at times, paranoid, frightened, unstable. Looking back now, it sounds like she was experiencing a serious mental health crisis, possibly schizophrenia or something similar. At the time, though, my grandparents didn't have the language or understanding to frame it that way. They believed she was possessed. That belief shaped everything that followed. Instead of seeing her as someone who had been traumatized and mentally unwell, they saw her as someone overtaken by something evil. Fear took over logic. They didn't know how to help her, only how to get her away from what they thought was causing it. Eventually, they sent her to a psychiatric hospital. That part of the story is complicated. On one hand, she needed help, real help. On the other hand, the reasons she was sent there were wrapped in fear, superstition, and misunderstanding rather than compassion and clarity. She wasn't treated as someone who had been harmed. She was treated as something that had gone wrong. She's fine now. That's important. She recovered. She got help. She rebuilt her life. But the road to that point was dark and confusing, and it left marks on everyone involved. There's one detail about that period that has always stayed with me. The man she was involved with lived in a house near the town cemetery. That alone wouldn't mean much, except for how the house looked. Above the entrance door, there was a black skull mounted prominently, like a symbol or warning. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't decorative in a normal way. It was there to be seen. As a kid, that image terrified me. A house near a cemetery. A black skull over the door. A woman who went in and came out broken. Adults whispering about demons, possession, and evil. Whether or not you believe in anything supernatural, that combination is enough to get inside a child's head and never fully leave. Even now, when I think about it, it feels heavy. Not because I believe the house itself was cursed, but because it became a symbol of everything that went wrong. It represented manipulation, abuse, and the way belief systems can be twisted to justify control over vulnerable people. Looking back as an adult, I see these stories differently than I did as a child. My kindergarten teacher wasn't a monster hiding behind a smile. He was a human being who committed an act of extreme violence, likely driven by something broken inside him. That doesn't excuse what he did, but it explains why the world isn't neatly divided into safe people and dangerous people. My aunt wasn't possessed. She was traumatized, drugged, abused, and pushed into a mental health crisis by someone who took advantage of her trust. The real horror wasn't demons. It was how easily someone vulnerable could be manipulated, and how quickly fear replaced understanding. What connects these stories for me is how close they were to home. These weren't distant news headlines. They weren't stories about strangers in faraway places. They were people I knew, people I was connected to, people who existed in spaces that were supposed to be safe, a classroom, a family, a neighborhood. They taught me, far earlier than most kids learn, that danger doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it looks familiar. Sometimes it wears a friendly face. Sometimes it hides behind belief, authority, or trust. And sometimes, the scariest part isn't what happened, but how long it took to understand what was really going on. Even now, these memories don't feel dramatic in a movie sense. They feel quiet, unsettling, and real. The kind of stories that don't end with a clear moral or a sense of closure. Just a lingering awareness that life can turn dark very close to home, and that innocence, once shaken, never fully returns. We live near a small forest at the edge of our village. People sometimes call it a forest, but it's not very big, not the kind you get lost in. It's more like a stretch of trees and undergrowth that separates different parts of the village. Streets cut through it, and there's a crossing about a kilometer from our house. And between the streets and the forest itself, there are a few rows of trees and a narrow path that people use for walking, hiking, or just getting some fresh air. It's always been a normal part of life for us. A few years ago, we got 2 dogs. From that point on, that area became even more familiar. We walked that path almost every day. Morning walks, evening walks, longer walks on weekends. Sometimes through the forest, sometimes along the fields nearby. It was routine, comfortable, safe. That kind of place where you stop thinking about danger because nothing bad has ever happened there. That's why what happened still feels so unsettling. 3 or 4 years ago, my parents were out walking the dogs, just like they had done countless times before. The weather wasn't great that day. It had been raining, and the streets were wet. Not dangerously stormy, just the kind of rain that makes everything slick and dull, the kind people barely register anymore because it happens so often. They were walking along the path, close to the road, with the forest right there beside them. Trees, wet leaves, dark soil, the usual view. Then it happened. A woman was driving along the street nearby. For reasons no one could fully control, she lost control of her car. The road was wet, the tires slipped, the car started sliding. In seconds, everything changed. The car spun, crossed the street, and went straight toward the forest. It didn't slow down in time. It didn't stop at the edge of the road. It left the street entirely and crashed into the wooded area. The point where the car entered the forest was only about 2 meters away from my parents. 2 meters. That distance is nothing. It's a step, a stumble. The space between standing safely and being directly in the path of something unstoppable. If they had been just slightly farther to the side, if they had paused for a moment, if they had taken a different step, the car would have hit them. They would have been crushed, killed. That day could have been the beginning of my life as an orphan. What makes it harder to process is how random it was. There was no warning, no build-up, no time to react. One moment they were walking the dogs, thinking about nothing important at all, and the next, a car was tearing into the forest right beside them. The woman didn't aim for them. She didn't intend to hurt anyone. It wasn't an act of violence or recklessness in the way people usually imagine danger. It was an accident, a loss of control, a slip on wet pavement. That's all it took. That's what makes it terrifying. Danger didn't come from something obviously risky. My parents weren't doing anything dangerous. They weren't crossing the road. They weren't standing in traffic. They were on a path meant for walking, separated from the street by trees. A place that felt protected. And yet, protection didn't matter. When you think about it afterward, your mind starts replaying everything. Every small decision, every step, every what if. What if they had left the house 5 minutes earlier? What if they had chosen a slightly different route? What if one of the dogs had stopped to sniff something, slowing them down by just a second or two? Any of those tiny changes could have put them directly in the path of that car. As a kid, you grow up believing that your parents are solid, permanent, that they'll always be there when you come home, that the world might be dangerous in abstract ways, but not in ways that will actually touch your family. This incident shattered that illusion quietly, without drama. There were no headlines, no long hospital stays, no funerals. The woman crashed. Emergency services came. Life went on. People talked about it briefly, then moved on to the next thing. The path stayed open. The forest stayed the same. Cars kept driving on that road. But for us, something changed. That spot never felt completely normal again. Every time we walk the dogs there now, even years later, I think about it. I look at the trees. I look at the edge of the road. I imagine the car sliding, spinning, crossing the line between the street and forest. I imagine how close it came. Sometimes I picture it too clearly. The sound, the sudden movement, the violence of something heavy and fast entering a place that's supposed to be quiet. What scares me most is how easily it could have gone unnoticed in a different way. If the car had been just a little closer, if my parents had been standing just a little farther over, if the accident had ended differently, it wouldn't just be a scary story. It would be the defining moment of my life. I would be telling it from a completely different place, from a life split in two. People talk about fate, luck, destiny, or chance when things like this happen. I don't know which one applies. All I know is that 2 meters decided everything. 2 meters separated normal life from irreversible loss. The forest didn't change. The road didn't change. But my understanding of safety did. Now I know that tragedy doesn't need drama. It doesn't need villains. It doesn't need warning signs. Sometimes it just needs rain, a slight turn of the wheel, and someone being in the wrong place at almost the wrong time. Almost. That's the word that stays with me. Almost lost them. Almost became an orphan. Almost everything changed. And every time I walk that path, with the dogs pulling gently on their leashes, with the trees standing quietly beside the road, I'm reminded of how thin the line really is between the life you have and the life you could have lost without ever seeing it coming. These are the kinds of stories that don't feel like stories at all when you grow up hearing them. They don't have neat beginnings or endings, and they don't feel distant or dramatic in the way crime shows do. They feel close, personal. Like danger has been circling the edges of your family for generations, sometimes brushing past, sometimes striking directly, sometimes vanishing without explanation. One of the earliest ones I heard came from my mother-in-law. She grew up in California, back when she was a teenager, in a time when kids still walked places alone, and people didn't yet live with constant fear of strangers. One night, she came home from a friend's house. It wasn't late enough to feel dangerous. Just a normal evening, the kind where you're thinking about homework or sleep or what you'll do the next day. She walked into her house and went toward her bedroom. That's when she saw him. Right outside, in the front yard, directly in front of her bedroom window, there was a man masturbating. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't trying to be discreet. He was standing there openly, deliberately positioned so that he could be seen from her room. That kind of moment freezes you. Your brain doesn't immediately know how to process it. It's shocking, violating, confusing all at once. This wasn't someone accidentally exposing himself. This was intentional. He wanted to be seen. He wanted her reaction. Eventually, he was caught. And when he was identified, the realization hit her much later, with far more weight than the initial shock. The man who had been standing in her front yard was the Night Stalker. Not the original, most famous one people usually think of, but another predator operating under that name, with a pattern of escalating behavior. That detail changed everything. What had felt like a horrifying but isolated incident suddenly became something much worse. She learned that if he hadn't been caught shortly after, she very likely could have been his next target. The man wasn't just exposing himself. He was watching, testing boundaries, getting closer, building up to something more violent. The thought that someone stood outside your bedroom window studying you, deciding whether or not you would be next, is the kind of thing that never fully leaves you. Even decades later, it changes how safe home feels. It turns a memory into a narrow escape. Another story in my family doesn't end with an escape at all. My father's mother was murdered when he was only 5 years old. He was too young to fully understand what had happened at the time. At that age, loss doesn't come with context. It comes with absence. Someone is just suddenly gone, and the adults around you change in ways you can't explain. Voices become quieter, faces become harder. Life splits into before and after, even if you don't have the words for it yet. She had been covering a shift for a friend at 7-Eleven. It was a favor, a simple act of kindness, helping someone else out. Those are the kinds of decisions you never imagine will cost you your life. Something went wrong during a robbery. From what the family was told, she was hit with a gun, presumably knocked unconscious. Instead of fleeing, instead of leaving her behind, the attackers took her body. They transported her to a nearby river. They stripped her of her clothes. Then they threw her into the water, face down. She drowned. There is something especially cruel about that detail. Not just the violence, but the effort. The deliberate choices made after she was already incapacitated. It wasn't enough to rob the store. It wasn't enough to hurt her. They erased her dignity. They erased her chance to survive. For my father, this loss shaped his entire life, even if he didn't talk about it much. Growing up without a mother leaves a hole that never really fills. It changes how you attach to people. It changes how you see the world. It teaches you very early that safety is not guaranteed, and that good people can be taken for reasons that make no sense at all. The story doesn't end there. On my mother's side of the family, now there's another disappearance that still hangs unanswered. Her cousin went Christmas shopping at a mall with her friends. 3 girls, young, excited, doing something completely ordinary during the holidays. They never came home. All 3 were abducted. They were never found. Over the years, investigators found several bodies that they believed might be hers. Each time, there was a horrible mix of hope and dread. Hope for answers. Hope for closure. Dread of confirmation. But none of the remains could ever be identified for sure. No definitive match. No certainty. The case became well known, the kind that stays in the public consciousness because it never resolves. Her name was Lisa Renee Wilson. What makes disappearances like that so haunting is the lack of an ending. There is no final moment to grieve, no grave to visit, no clear truth to hold on to. Just questions that stretch on year after year, decade after decade. Was she killed quickly, or did she suffer? Did she try to escape? Did she think about her family? Did she believe she would be found? Families of missing people live in a strange emotional limbo. They grieve without proof. They hope without evidence. Every unidentified body becomes a possible answer and a possible nightmare. Time doesn't heal that kind of wound. It just stretches it thinner until it becomes part of daily life. When you put all of these stories together, what's unsettling isn't just the violence, it's the pattern. A teenage girl nearly targeted by a serial predator, saved only by timing. A woman murdered because she covered a shift for a friend. 3 girls vanishing from a public place during one of the busiest shopping seasons of the year. None of these people were doing anything dangerous. None of them were reckless. None of them were seeking trouble. They were living ordinary lives, making ordinary decisions, trusting that the world would behave the way it usually does. And it didn't. These stories also reshape how you think about evil. It doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it stands quietly in your front yard. Sometimes it waits behind the counter of a convenience store. Sometimes it blends into crowds at a mall, choosing victims who will simply vanish. For my mother-in-law, the knowledge that she had been watched by someone who went on to become a known predator added a layer of fear to her past that she didn't fully understand at the time. What once felt like a single horrifying moment turned into a near-death experience in hindsight. The realization that she might have been next is something that stays with you forever. For my father, losing his mother at such a young age meant growing up with an absence that no explanation could fill. It shaped his sense of responsibility, his resilience, and his understanding of loss. He didn't just lose a parent. He lost the version of childhood where adults protect you from the worst parts of the world. For my mother's family, the disappearance of Lisa Renee Wilson became a story without resolution, a name spoken carefully, a photograph frozen in time, a future that never arrived. It's the kind of case that turns holidays into reminders and public spaces into sources of anxiety. What ties all of these together is how close they are to home. These aren't distant historical crimes. They aren't abstract statistics. They're people connected to me by blood or marriage, people whose lives intersected with violence in ways that feel almost impossible to predict or prevent. It makes you realize that safety is often an illusion built on routine. We believe certain places are safe because they usually are. Homes, stores, malls, neighborhoods. We assume danger belongs somewhere else to other people, in other circumstances. But these stories prove otherwise. They show how thin the line is between an ordinary night and a life-altering event. How a few minutes, a wrong person, or a bad decision by someone else can change everything. How sometimes survival depends on timing alone, and sometimes it doesn't come at all. Growing up with stories like these changes you. It makes you more aware, more cautious, sometimes more anxious. You learn early that the world isn't divided cleanly into safe and unsafe spaces, that predators don't always look threatening, that kindness, like covering a shift for a friend, doesn't protect you from cruelty. At the same time, it also creates a strange sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the people who survived. Gratitude for the moments that went differently than they could have. Gratitude for the fact that some stories, like my mother-in-law's, end with almost instead of gone, But that gratitude is always mixed with grief for the ones that didn't. For a grandmother drowned in a river. For 3 girls who never came home. For a cousin whose name became part of a case instead of a future. These aren't stories you ever really get used to. They resurface at unexpected times. When you look out a bedroom window at night, when you stop at a convenience store, when you walk through a mall during the holidays, they remind you that danger doesn't always announce itself, and that survival is sometimes nothing more than being in the right place at the right time, or the wrong place at the right moment. And once you understand that, you never see the world the same way again. I was about 14 years old when this happened, out hunting with my father in eastern Oregon. At that age, everything feels sharper, more intense, and that trip was no exception. Eastern Oregon isn't the kind of place most people picture when they think of the state. It's not green forests and rain. It's high desert, rugged land that stretches out in muted colors. Rolling hills, rocky ridges, shallow mountains, and wide open space broken up by endless sagebrush. It feels empty in a way that's both peaceful and intimidating. We were hunting mule deer, moving slowly and carefully through the terrain. The air was dry, the ground uneven, and every step had to be placed with intention. Sound carries differently out there. A footstep, a scrape of gear, even breathing too loud can feel like a mistake. That kind of environment forces you to be focused, or at least it's supposed to. At some point, we spotted him. He was standing on a ridge directly in front of us, about 150 yards out. Even at that distance, there was no mistaking what we were looking at. This wasn't just any deer. He was massive, a true trophy buck. The kind people talk about for years and maybe never see again. He looked old, experienced, like he had survived many seasons already. His rack was enormous. So many points that counting them felt pointless. If I had to guess, it was at least a 12-point buck, maybe more. For a moment, everything else faded away. My dad slowly moved into a kneeling position, careful and deliberate, preparing to take a shot. I remember watching him, my heart pounding, caught between excitement and nerves. There's a strange mix of emotions in moments like that. Awe at the animal, adrenaline at the possibility. Focus so intense it feels like the world narrows down to just you, the deer, and the space between. Then everything shattered. Out of nowhere, we heard an incredibly loud whizzing sound. It cut through the air so violently that it didn't register immediately as danger. A split second later, there was a loud crack, sharp, explosive. The sound echoed off the hills. Then it happened again, and again. At first, my brain struggled to make sense of it. It didn't sound like my dad's rifle. The timing was wrong. The direction felt wrong. The noise was too close, too aggressive, slicing through the air above us. Then it clicked. Someone was shooting, and they were shooting over us. The realization hit like ice water. I dropped to the ground instantly, pure instinct taking over before thought could catch up. I pressed myself into the dirt, heart racing so hard it felt like it was trying to escape my chest. The open landscape that had felt calm and beautiful seconds earlier suddenly felt exposed and dangerous. As I lay there, I saw the buck react. That massive deer leapt into the air, easily 5 feet off the ground, pure muscle and panic in motion. He bolted, disappearing over the ridge in seconds, gone as if he had never been there at all. One moment, he was the focus of everything. The next, he was just another ghost of the desert. The shot stopped. Silence returned, but it wasn't the same silence as before. It felt heavier, broken. My ears rang. My hands shook. I stayed on the ground for a moment longer, not trusting that it was truly over. When we finally stood up, the reality of what had almost happened settled in. We were incredibly lucky. Neither of us had been hit. But it felt uncomfortably close. Too close. Like the bullets had passed just feet from where we were standing. Later, we found out who had been shooting. We actually knew him. He swore he hadn't seen us. And I believe him. Out there, it's easy to get tunnel vision, especially when you spot a big buck. Hunters even have a name for it. Buck fever. When adrenaline takes over and everything else disappears, your focus narrows so tightly that you stop registering your surroundings the way you should. That doesn't make it less terrifying. Looking back now from the outside, the story might not sound that scary. No one was hurt, no blood, no dramatic rescue, just a near miss in a wide open landscape. But being there, in that moment, was different. There's something uniquely frightening about realizing how fragile your safety really is. 1 second you're standing, watching your father line up a shot. The next, bullets are cracking through the air above you, and you're pressed into the dirt, hoping you're not about to be hit by something you never even saw coming. What stuck with me most wasn't just the danger. It was how fast everything changed. How quickly excitement turned into fear. How easily something routine could have ended in tragedy. A few feet, a slight difference in angle, a moment longer standing upright instead of hitting the ground. Any of those could have changed the outcome completely. That day taught me something I didn't fully understand at 14, but I do now. Danger doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives without warning, carried on a sound you don't recognize until it's already too close. Sometimes it comes from people who don't even know they're putting you at risk. We packed up and left not long after. The hunt was over, whether we wanted to admit it or not. The buck was gone, but that didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that we were still there, still breathing, still able to walk away. Even now, years later, I can still hear that whizzing sound in my head if I think about it too long. I can still feel the jolt of fear, the instinctive drop to the ground, the sudden understanding of how close things can come to going terribly wrong. From the outside, it's just a hunting story. From the inside, it was the moment I learned how thin the line can be between an ordinary day and something irreversible. Look, if you're still watching, you already know what this channel is. No jump scares, no fake drama, just real stories about real people who survive things most of us can't even imagine. And that's scarier than any movie could ever be. If you want more of this raw, unfiltered truth, told the way it deserves to be told, subscribe to Lacuna Noir. We're not here to waste your time. We're here to tell the stories that actually matter. Thanks for listening. Now go get some sleep, if you can.